come through now. So the usual awkward few seconds while we wait for everybody who's been sitting in the waiting room in Zoom to be pulled through live so you can actually see us. So if you can just bear with us just for a few seconds, I can see the numbers going up very rapidly, and then we will actually kick off in just a few more seconds. Anyone who's just coming through, we're just waiting a few seconds to make sure that we're not starting ahead of everybody actually being able to see and hear us. So just a couple more seconds, we'll leave it, because I can again still see people are kind of making their way through from the waiting room. So then we'll start in just a few seconds. Okay. So welcome everybody. I am delighted that we have Lord Gus O'Donnell back. For anyone who was with us last time, you'll remember we had some technical difficulties, making I think the case very much for gigabit and kind of upgrades to broadband, etc. But Lord O'Donnell has very kindly given us a new slot today that we can chat to him. So thank you so much. Can I welcome both everybody who is with us in Zoom, if I can put it that way, but also I know that we've got people who are watching live on our YouTube channel, so welcome to you as well. Just to very quickly, because everybody is almost too familiar, is probably the way of putting it, with how Zoom now works, but just very quickly the logistics. So if you have a question that you would like me to put to Lord O'Donnell, then please do use the Q&A function if you're in Zoom. So you'll see there's a little Q&A function at the bottom if you hover your mouse at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I won't be checking the chat, so please do make sure that you put questions into that Q&A button. If you are watching on YouTube, you can still ask questions. Obviously, you can't put them in that Q&A function. So you can just tweet them at us at Reform Think Tank, and one of my colleagues will pop them into the Q&A function so that I can see them. So it doesn't matter where you are, you can still ask a question, either tweet it at us or put it into that Zoom function. I will spend the first period, which will be an absolute pleasure, asking my own questions of Lord O'Donnell, and then I will open it up to the questions that we get through. If you've already come with questions, if you maybe had a question from last time that obviously we didn't get to being able to put, then you can pop that straight into the Q&A now. You don't need to wait. Or if you've got questions that kind of come to mind as we're chatting, then you can just add them as and when. Lord O'Donnell really doesn't need any introduction, but as ever, I will just remind anyone who I don't know has not been aware for the last couple of decades anything to do with politics, that obviously Lord O'Donnell was Cabinet Secretary and Head of the Civil Service for 3 different Prime Ministers, so has an incredible wealth of experience on how government runs, how you drive change, the challenges and pitfalls of trying to do so, but also since leaving government, I mean actually whilst in government, but also since leaving government, has been a real pioneer of how we think differently about kind of what a prosperous society looks like and how we value our lives in society, and so has been a real pioneer of the well-being agenda, and I'm very keen that we get on to talk about that. So welcome, Lord O'Donnell. Thank you so much again for giving us more time. It is a pleasure. Last time we talked a bit about the sort of fallout of the pandemic, public inquiries, the more technical end. I feel it would be slightly remiss of me not to mention the sort of slightly epic circus that came to town yesterday. I don't want us to get into the kind of, the sort of slight kind of revenge, vendetta type elements that I think we saw a bit of, and the kind of sort of blame game that I think is certainly one of Reform Think Tank's worries that public inquiry might head down. But there were nonetheless some kind of serious points, I think, that Dom Cummings raised around sort of the preparedness of government for a pandemic, the capabilities perhaps in the civil service, and I think the kind of decision-making machine in general and how that operated. And I wondered therefore whether we could just sort of discuss briefly the sort of deja vu conversation of civil service reform. It also, Dom Cummings has said, also came off the back of a Social Mobility Commission report last week about sort of the makeup and how people from more disadvantaged backgrounds find it hard to progress in the civil service, which maybe contributes to some of the groupthink that Dom Cummings talked about and others have talked about. And also we had the Policy Exchange Commission on government civil service reform that called for sort of, modernisation of government and civil service. So I guess can I start with just a sort of very open question, which is, we have this discussion an awful lot. It sort of seems every other year at least. What really are the challenges in terms of civil service reform, and why do we find it so difficult to tackle some of the barriers that people repeatedly raise?
Right, very good question. And I'm delighted to be here from the offices of Frontier Economics, where the broadband is much better than it is at my home. Be pleased to know. Civil service reform comes up perennially. And if you look back to all of the reports we've had, going back to Northcote Trevelyan, remember we started off with a civil service that was totally corrupt, was all about nepotism and no free competition and all the rest of it. And all of those moves towards making it much more of a meritocracy have really made a difference, I think, to the civil service. But like every organization, like reform itself, we need to move on. The civil service is not the perfect item. There's not a head of the civil service who's ever thought that. And we need to modernize, we need to keep up with modern times. But there are some constraints, right? And the people need to realize why doesn't it happen and why do we keep coming back to it? Well, number one, we live in a democracy. And if you look at companies, whatever, where they're led by somebody, a CEO who's an absolute expert in running, be it a pharmaceutical company or something like that. Well, Lee Lewis, who was the permanent secretary at DWP, told me he had 9 ministers for pensions in 5 years. I mean, not exactly a short-term subject, right? So you have to manage that process. So the civil service needs to have skills that aren't necessarily ones you get in the private sector, which is dealing with a number of bosses, ultimate decision makers, who may not know much about the subject and may not be there for very long. So that's really, really unusual in the private sector. So there's that challenge, first of all. Then there are some self-imposed things which are, to use the technical term, bonkers, right? Number one, and I to be honest, I blame Francis more for this, civil service pay. No one can be paid more than the Prime Minister. What a crazy notion. We all know that Prime Ministers, this one, probably more than any other, will make a fortune from writing his memoirs. They'll probably be very well written and they'll be extremely entertaining, I'm sure. So it's just the wrong metric. Dominic Cummings was talking about open competition yesterday for jobs. I'm very much in favour of lots of open competition. But if we're going to try and compete for jobs in the digital space, in the commercial space, we need to accept the fact that private sector salaries are massively more than ours. And when you think about all of those other jobs where maybe the pay is not so far apart, we do this really crazy thing, which anyone who's ever studied behavioral economics will understand, which is we pay people most of the money after they've left. I mean, how mad is that, right? So we have a benefits package, which is very strong on pensions and weak on pay. Why do we never change that? I have tried this with chancellors from all parties. And of course, the problem is when you look at Treasury scorecards and the way it's added up and the way that chancellors decide they want to think about this is borrowing requirements, deficits, that sort of thing, where the extra pay, if we paid more, would show up immediately, but the unfunded public sector liabilities on pensions show up nowhere. So actually, if you reduce the pension and increase the pay, all it will show up is the public finances have got worse, which is a crazy thing, and which chancellors could choose to say, okay, I'm not going to worry about that. We're going to educate the markets and that will be fine. So I think there are things like that. There's always going to be problems in those commercial areas, those areas that are relatively high pay. And I think it tracks across to your point you made about the diversity of the civil service, right? I'm really pleased we had that report about the class issue, right? Because in my day, I was battling a lot with gender diversity, which we have made a lot of progress on. We haven't made as much progress on ethnic diversity, but that's coming, I hope. The question about class was always an issue because we didn't have any data. So I started this thing called the Civil Service Survey, People Survey. So we started collecting this sort of data so we can actually analyse the question. And I think what you'll find is a lot of people from poorer backgrounds are really keen to go into areas because for them, money matters, right? They're quite poor. They're trying to make it, particularly when it's London and the Southeast, on a relatively low income. How do you get onto the housing ladder? If you start in the civil service, it's bad enough in my day, and you haven't got a bank of mum and dad, right? Then it's really hard to get in there. So quite often what happens is either the people that join the civil service have got the bank of mum and dad, and they have come from a more privileged background, and so they are able to get into the housing market in London, whereas others think they can't. Then the only way to do this is to join an investment bank or someone that's going to pay you this crazy salary, which is going to allow you to get into the housing market. And a lot of them come to me and say, look, I really want to work in the civil service. And some people leave the civil service to go into those private sector places. And I'm only going to be there for a few years. But I call it like golden handcuffs. Once you've got the big mortgage, once you've got established a lifestyle which involves buying new cars. I've never bought a new car in my life, right? Ever. Then you get into this, you get trapped. You can't leave it. So you end up in these jobs which pay you a lot, but actually I'd say are much less rewarding than they are in the public sector. So I think that explains a lot of what's the problems we face on.
And can a couple of follow-up questions on that? So there clearly is, though, still a challenge, I think, with recruiting. So I couldn't agree more about the pay. It's ludicrous, particularly if you think about some of the size of the departments and the responsibilities that, someone like a permanent secretary or director general has, and yet the pay is nowhere appropriate to what it should be. And that obviously filters down. But clearly there's a challenge in who even knows you could join something like the fast stream, for example, in the first place. How do you get the people who are from more diverse backgrounds that therefore might add real value in terms of breaking, we all know that high performing organizations tend to be organizations that have a diverse set of views, experiences in them. So there's clearly a challenge at that end. And just a very quick question, and the ministerial change, and I worked very briefly for Lee Lewis when I went in as an advisor to IDS before he retired, brilliantly knowledgeable and expert permanent secretary, and his point is very valid. But equally, I think it's the Institute of Government have pointed out that I think senior civil servants spend kind of on average about 2 years in their roles. So the churn in the civil service is compounding the churn at a ministerial level. So I wonder just briefly on that point about how do you actually get people from more diverse backgrounds to apply in the first place, aside from the money issue, but also what about this churn at the SCS level? Sure.
And that's both very good questions. So the diversity point is, when you look at an organization and you think they're not like me, why would you apply, right? And so there's a kind of chicken and egg thing here. We need to change things. We need to get more different people out there. And look, no one's ever accused me of having a cut glass Oxford accent, right? I was brought up state primary school, state secondary school in Battersea. So, and you look at Jeremy Hayward, Andrew Turnbull, there's lots and lots of people who have got to the top in the civil service who did not go anywhere near a public school. So that's important, is to get that message across. When I was head of the civil service, I used to make a point of going on recruitment trips to places like Oxford, where I go to Oxford Brookes, not Oxford. I go to Manchester Trent, not Manchester Uni. And I try and find, because people that have worked their way through, there are absolute magnificent, high potential people. So yes, we need to change. And, we need to change the stereotype of things like Sir Humphrey and Yes Minister and in the thick of it. It's not like that. And we need to show that you can get there through many different backgrounds. And we just need to appeal to that sense of public service, which I think actually pervades a lot of people, because a lot of what the civil service is doing is helping those people that need the state's help. So they're more disadvantaged groups. So my God, yes, we need that. You know, I learn as much now about what's going on with the effectiveness of government through the fact that my wife is an advisor for the Citizens Advice Bureau. You know, she sees the problems, right? And that's, if you don't have that kind of front line and feel and that ability to talk to people from all backgrounds and understand their issues and why the particular thing you've organized for them doesn't actually work because it assumes things that are just not correct. So yes, we need to reach out to more people, and that's going to take time, I think, but it's partly as well about the image. You know, I think a lot of people feel that you go in the civil service and you get blamed for things, you get briefed against by ministers, and it's really quite hard. There's a lot of really good people come through and they look at those top jobs and think, you know what, there's very little extra pay. I'm going to be appearing before select committees, probably not for 6.5 hours, but, you know, they're only really interested in discussing failures. There's very few, you know, show me the select committee that says, oh, we'd like to discuss why this was such a success. It doesn't happen, right? So, you know, it's a tough job, and we need to go out there, explain to people the great, and to my mind, I have no regrets ever about being a civil servant. I loved it. I loved every second of it.
And just very briefly on that churn at the top, so the fact
yes,
that civil service.
Yeah. So Institute for Government, I think I still have some slight disagreement with the figures because people can move within the same department, and you know it might well be that those are quite similar jobs and their backgrounds. But in general, I think the point is correct that too often we find that people have to keep moving to get promoted, right? That's how they see their career structure. And I introduced this thing in Treasury where, you know, I'd come in as an academic economist. I'd come in as a complete outsider. I was a kind of slightly, you know, keep me up in the ivory tower. Don't let me kind of meet with ministers. That was, you know, far too dangerous. And so I do agree with a lot of the things that Dominic Cummings said about weirdos. You know, I genuinely felt like being a weirdo. You know, I was there for my econometrics and my modeling skills at the start, which was like, you know, things he seems to like. So that's good. But I think there is that element of churn, which is too much. And we need to get people who are experts in a particular area. We need to give them a career structure, which doesn't necessarily mean they have to move around. Although, so there'll be some like that, the gurus, the experts. There'll also be some who need to be able to see across the whole picture. Because, you know, how many times, if you talked about civil service reform, you've done anything, people will tell you, we're not joined up, right? We need to work across departments. And of course it's true. You know, you look at social care and health issues, you look at the whole well-being issue. It's a cross-departmental issue. It shouldn't be about health. It should be about much more. So, yeah, we need that ability to work across boundaries. So you need a whole set of different skills. I started with one specialism, which was economics, and I realized it has great strengths and great weaknesses, and I needed other things. And, you know, you pick up those skills as you move around. I learned a huge amount by being press secretary to John Major, mostly by making lots of mistakes and learning from them. So, you know, I think there is a lot to be said for that mix of specialists and, if you like, generalists, people who can see the bigger picture. But we do need to work very hard to actually get those people, particularly things like digital skills, where we need a lot more of them. You know, Estonia, for God's sake, is ahead of us. That can't be, you know, we need to get better at this.
We could definitely, I mean, I could ask 100 other questions on civil service reform, but I do want to kind of move us on. So specifically about the machinery of government, one of the things that that marathon session yesterday, Dom Cummings, I suppose, highlighted, but I think has been, you know, a discussion for, again, a long, long time, is how you build a functional number 10. And there are clearly big tensions between having a number 10 that can drive change, and you want that to be possible. You want the Prime Minister to be able to deliver his or her agenda. and you need number 10 to be able to hold people to account for that change, driving that change. Equally, what you don't want is a number 10 that's a bottleneck, because they need to see everything. Everything has to come across, a SPAD's desk in number 10 or whatever, so that departments get frustrated and can't get on with reforming things and changing things. Clearly, under Blair, there were lots of shifts, kind of little units created. I mean, how do you create that functional number 10 so that decision making is timely, effective, and the system can work well?
Well, it absolutely starts from the top. So if you have a prime minister that uses their cabinet and actually understands that he is leading a team, he or she is leading a team, and you need to empower them, and you need to be very clear about what they want to do. The obvious things don't happen. Like I remember with Tony Blair, we tried this idea of saying, well, let's have some objectives for ministers. Let's have some objectives for Secretary of State. This is what you want to do. You'll discuss it with them and you'll agree it. And then you'll let them get on and do it. And you'll have proper discussions at cabinet. One of the things Dominic Cummings revealed was there wasn't much cabinet discussion through the COVID period, which is, I find, very worrying. How do you build a team that are all working together? And this, needed people to work across departments very much. And it wasn't happening. So I think get it from the top. And you need to try and instill in the Prime Minister that feeling of you are leader of a team. And it's not all about you. There are things only you can do, but there are also, you'll never be able to do it all. And if you try and do it all, you will get the bottlenecks that you referred to. That's the ideal. You don't get the ideal, right? We have to deal with what we've got. And different Prime Ministers have different skills. So you then try and build up number 10 to work in the best way with departments. One of the things that I would say the Cabinet Secretary needs to do is have a really good team of permanent secretaries. We meet as regularly, probably more regularly than Cabinet. Wednesday morning, 10 o'clock, we all get together. We all discuss those things which cross departmental boundaries and which are a problem for us. And we try and work out how we can help our ministers to deliver what the government wants. And that works well if that team's working well. And that team needs to trust each other. There needs to be the right delegation. And again, it's a leadership issue. Number 10 itself needs to understand that it's part of that issue and they need to build teams. So you need Jonathan Powell when he was working for Tony Blair. You need to think about how you manage that set of special advisors across all the departments, because otherwise they can go rogue. I remember David Cameron having real problems with a rogue special advisor, a chap called Dominic Cummings, who was at education, who was not obeying what the Prime Minister thought they should be doing. If they don't work as a team and they're all saying, well, my job is to maximize the importance and political standing of my minister, I'm not really that interested in government as a whole. I'm certainly not interested in delivering something that somebody else gets the credit for. Then you've got problems, right? And of course, a lot of special advisors are very incentivized to work for an individual, not for the government. And that's a problem. So you need to sort out number 10. And then number 10 has certain functions that only number 10 can do in terms of the power to bring people together. So the National Security Council is a great example of really bringing different departments together. We've had, I call them incubators, little areas where you really want to concentrate on something, be it homelessness or a specific problem. Then you can bring it into number 10 for a while, get it going, and then try and allocate it out to somewhere else. So it's always a difficult balance between the strength of number 10 and the Cabinet Office and departments. And that will change with the personalities of ministers. What you need will change, and with different issues. Something like COVID, you'd like to think required a lot of teamwork, but it also required something which I think came out of that session yesterday. You actually needed to do things at speed.
Yeah.
And you needed sometimes to cut through everything. And that requires a number 10 that is decisive. And I think one of the issues we saw yesterday was there was a real problem about decisions being changed and fluctuating. And that, in a crisis, must have made things incredibly hard for my successors.
Thank you. That's incredibly helpful, I think, in terms of thinking about what might need to happen. It does also make me think of in the coalition years, the quad model that kind of supplemented the for those kind of trickier decisions that needed to be made. But I'm going to move us on to talking about the bit which I think, I suppose I'm most excited about, and particularly to be able to talk to you about, which is how, this kind of great phrase everybody's banding about of kind of building back better, and kind of what does that actually mean? Because it feels at times like it means we'll give more money to the NHS, we'll improve some roads, we'll put some cranes in the north, build some things. And you've been very passionate, I think, about arguing that actually that's the physical, the infrastructure, the kind of economics isn't necessarily, for a lot of people, the big thing that's impacting their lives. And so you've talked about needing a huge shift in priorities, I think you wrote in the Times, focusing more on well-being. Can you just explain what you mean by that and what you'd like to see happen?
Certainly, and this started way back in the beginning of the coalition government with David Cameron, us collecting the data. Basically, I've always taken the view that this is very simple. What are governments there for? They're there to improve the quality of people's lives in the country, right? Not rocket science. Who could argue with that? And if you like, you can use different language, and different people do. In Canada, they're using quality of life. A lot of other countries like New Zealand, they've got well-being budgets. They're doing things like this in Scotland and Wales and lots of other countries now. It's spreading and it's becoming a global movement. And basically it's saying, so what is it that really matters to people? And we had the Office of National Statistics go around and ask people what were the things that really mattered to them. And then they formulated these 4 questions about, just asking people overall, how satisfied are you with your life? Do you think it's worthwhile? And questions about their happiness and their anxiety, so positive and negative emotions, and trying to get a feeling for the things that really matter to them. And the reason I'm so passionate about the well-being is I think it's an incredibly democratic thing. It's not you or I telling people what constitutes a good life for you. It's us asking people. This is very democratic grassroots. So how's your life going? And it could be that their life's going really badly. And that may have nothing to do with some of the things we think. And we need to learn what it is. And when you go to these areas, you talk about building back better and leveling up, both really good ideas. And you look at those areas where there are very low levels of well-being, well, you can start to pin down, well, what are the reasons for this? And it could be, in some cases, it could be lack of jobs. That's a fairly common thing. There's no meaningful employment, or what employment there is not good work. So good jobs is massively important. Could be poverty, could be very low income. But it could also be things like there's no social infrastructure in an area. The local pub's shut, the community library's closed. There's nowhere for people to meet. Their feeling of identity with the place has gone. There's loads of things which we would call social infrastructure or social capital, which have declined quite seriously. And a lot of people now are doing research in this area. The local trusts are doing some great work on this. And I think we're beginning to realize that, the Building Back Better agenda the government's got, which is massively concentrated on physical capital and some of that, like broadband extension, may be brilliant, but just roads and things, if you miss out that understanding about place and identity, you're going to lose a lot of what really matters. And of course, that community spirit, we've had this great growth of voluntary work, helping each other, food banks, all these local community-led things, which we actually need to encourage. And I think that's how I would build back better. And I think it will be great for the country as a whole. And
you mentioned there kind of social infrastructure, social capital, which again, sort of words that have kind of come into fashion, slightly gone out of fashion over probably the last decade, as you said, kind of with David Cameron coming in and talking about well-being. One of the things that I guess we maybe talk about less, but is relationships. And maybe we talk about it less because it's really hard. What's the, it's easy for the government to say we're going to build a hospital or we're going to, fix a train line. But to say how do we enable people to have meaningful relationships and support them to do so is really difficult. And yet, if you look at all the evidence, strong, healthy, meaningful relationships are actually one of the biggest predictors of someone's outcomes in life, whether that's family or neighborhood, or, you know, like you said, participation in kind of local organizations or groups. How far do you think there is a role for the state to try and help enable that? Because if we're going to, you talked about purpose or meaning in people's lives, that's so core to that. And is there a role for the state? Can you see that role for the state in trying to support people to build that part of their lives?
I can, and you're absolutely right that, you know, when I was going through that list of things that matter for well-being about poverty and jobs and all the rest of it, relationships is right up there. You're absolutely right. The evidence firmly backs you up. And when you think about it, you know, the whole issue about, you know, what creates problems for kids and their education and the like turns out to be real problems early on, you know. So, you know, things like Sure Start program, which I think, you know, had a lot going for it, but trying to help with parenting, trying to help at school. But, you know, you take schools, and I can quite understand why Tony Blair, Michael Barber, they did great stuff in delivery, but it was about grades A to C. And actually, I think if we turn that focus in saying delivering kids who've got high levels of well-being and resilience, actually, it turns out from the evidence in the Richard Lau book, The Origins of Happiness, that they do better in exams. So you really don't need. So, you know, we should be focusing our education system more on this. And, you know, for individuals now, there's things like loneliness. There's lots of things where all of these things about relationships that we could help with. And by saying we, I don't mean the state saying you have got to talk to your neighbors or whatever. I think these things are best devolved down to community level, which is why we need the social capital of strong community organizations and strong civic sector to actually sort out, well, what are the specific issues in this area? Because they will vary from area to area. And the state should be there ready to provide what help it can. And it may be money, it may be resources, you know, there could be all sorts of different things in order to help those communities help people with relationship issues. And to be honest, we all know, all the evidence shows that investments in these areas have very high social returns. Not only high social returns, but, you know, if you help kids and they go down a path where they end up in good jobs, paying taxes, as opposed to not in jobs, on benefits, in jail, then, you know, from a treasury, as an ex-head of treasury, for me, God, that's brilliant to put someone on that first path rather than the other path. And I think it's that basic lesson of well-being, which is, if you really want to help people, put money into prevention, not cure, and stop these bad things happening.
And I think, I mean, that's an incredibly important point, and perhaps we could reflect on how far the Treasury are likely to move in that direction. But, you know, I suppose in thinking about the current approach to public services and the kind of current model we have in terms of the sort of institutions and approaches, you know, a lot of these were designed in the post-war period to tackle very different issues. You mentioned loneliness, which we now know is not just a devastating mental health challenge, but actually, you know, I think it's the equivalent of smoking multiple cigarettes a day in terms of physical damage as a result of loneliness. You know, we know that Robert Putnam's done great work in showing that social areas with social capital have far lower crime rates, you know, so actually, do we want to invest in more police officers, or do we want to try and invest in the social capital that might keep communities safe? You know, is the NHS the right model to try and, you know, tackle the kind of the big health challenges we have today? Do you think we need to start having a conversation about not just tweaking, because, you know, you're right on prevention, but most of the institutions we've got aren't designed to do prevention particularly effectively, or indeed can't do it very effectively because they're not the right institutions. Do you think it's time to see this as a paradigm shift moment and talk a bit more radically?
Totally, because, you know, Nigel Crisp, former head of NHS, wrote this book about, you know, health is made at home, hospitals are for repairs, right? And I think part of the problem is the politics of it. You're Secretary of State for Health. You want to announce new hospitals, more doctors, more nurses. Actually, I want a world where we don't need as many hospitals or nurses or doctors. You know, I don't want to need as many prisons. I want to reduce these things, but I want to do it by tackling the problems at source. So yes, I think we should be having this debate about prevention, not cure. When you look at the numbers, we spend a tiny fraction of our budgets on prevention as opposed to cure. You look at the drugs budget, you look at the stuff we're doing with hospitals and the social care stuff. If we could find ways to stop this. I remember being in Singapore for their civil service awards, and they gave these awards to people who had tackled the issue, what they call frequent flyers in hospital. They were people who were in and out of hospital all the time. And basically, instead of the real expense of them being in hospital so much, they sent people home with them and realized that there were some steps they kept falling over. There were some various things relatively cheaply they could change to their domestic environment, which would stop them coming in and out of hospital so much. And so there are lots of things like that where we could get into so let's look at the causes of this and let's tackle the causes. I remember there was a prime minister, wasn't there, who said it's all about the causes of crime. I think we should go back to that, looking at the causal roots.
And then another one that said hug a hoodie or didn't say it either way. So there does seem to be a theme of people believing it, but not translating it then when you're,
right.
You're actually in government. I'm very conscious I'm hogging all of the questions. So I'm going to start kind of going through some of the ones because we've had lots coming in on Q&A. Just a reminder to people watching, if you're watching on the YouTube, you can tweet us a question and we'll still be able to put that to Lord O'Donnell. Otherwise, you can pop your questions if you are in Zoom into the Q&A function. So one of the questions we've got, which is, again, one of the perennial challenges, is about social care. And sort of links to what we've just been talking about there. So the question is, with an increasing aging population and a shrinking pool of carers, social care is just going to cost more and more to deliver. I mean, the question is, how do you fix social care, which seems like a very large question that we could have a long conversation about. But are there certain principles or certain, I guess, frameworks we should be thinking about in terms of the social care question?
Yes, and I think, lots of people have looked at this. Most recently, I think Andrew Dilnut's report, and frankly, you need to understand that this is going to cost some money. And we need to think about how we're going to raise that money. And as the questioner implied, we are, and we should celebrate this. We're living longer, thank goodness. And we're living higher quality of lives for longer, although as some people like Angus Deaton are pointing out, that's starting to level off. And it's in particular, there's a great deal of inequality in it. Richer people are going to carry on living longer. So we need to think about that. We need to think about how we can manage this in different ways. I think that the whole concept of, to what extent do we want to encourage people to have independent living? To what extent do we want to encourage people that would prefer or need to come together in different ways? One of the classic behavioral things is, the old people's home with the nursery beside it actually improves the well-being of both groups. I think we need a bit more creativity. And I think we need to think about, there are a lot of people who retire at 60, 65, 70, who are very active and want to do something. And I think if we could harness that desire to do things and their ability to say something as simple as drive people around and help with the shopping, reduce the loneliness factor. We've done some of that during COVID. People have looked around their street. I know in my street, it's, messages through your door saying, if you want help, I will go and do your shop. I mean, it's fantastic. We could take that spirit and say, why do we only have this during a pandemic? Why can't we do this generally? If there are people in your street who are lonely and you can help and you've got time, believe me, from a well-being point of view, it's, it really is good for you. You really feel, I think, what are the things that make you feel good? It's like making someone else feel good. That makes a huge difference. So I think getting involved in charities, volunteering, for that older group who've got plenty of capacity and desire to help. I think that's a kind of untapped source at the minute. Let's not have them spend all their days on the golf course. So I have nothing against them playing golf and doing, staying fit. But also, in the times when they're not, what about doing some of these other things?
Yeah, and that I think is one of the experiments that Hilary Cotton was involved in, getting the kind of younger, older people involved in creating the kind of friendship networks, as much as then doing the practical thing of, well, I can come over and fix your light bulb or cut your grass or whatever. So there's definitely examples of that being done very effectively. But again, it's bolt-ons to the system rather than the kind of system change. In terms of, so we've got another question about sort of, I suppose, kind of devolution, both in terms of devolving to a kind of lower level of government, and we know that we have an incredibly centralized state in the UK, but also devolving more to communities and to the civil society infrastructure you've talked about. I suppose I'm going to add a part of the question. So the question we've got is sort of what steps can be taken to enable that to happen. But I guess my subset of a question would be, how optimistic are you that it will happen? Because again, it feels like something that in opposition, everybody's very for devolution, and you get into power and suddenly you realize you kind of want to keep those levers and not let go of them.
Yeah, this is a really good question, because I've struggled with this many times. I mean, as you can imagine, in the Treasury, there's a kind of culture of, oh my God, we can't trust anybody else with public money, and we need to keep firm control. I think that's changing, and I think we need to try and find more kind of local sources of revenue as well, and how you kind of localize that as well, which creates more accountability, responsibility. But how do we make it happen? I think one of the ways to make it happen is to basically unleash this civil society that we've got. I think it's nowhere near its potential. And I think we need to understand how it can best work with the public and private sectors. We've got things where the state comes in and does things which are, if you like, cookie cutter. They're there for everybody. They're a kind of, by definition, you're treating everybody the same, irrespective of where they are or, sometimes what their needs are. And so we need to find a way of having a state which can adjust things in different ways without hitting this critique that you always get of, oh, it's a postcode lottery. I can get this in this area, but I can't get it somewhere else. And it's a big issue, which I'm going to give you an unashamed plug now, which is why I'm chairing something called the Law Family Commission on Civil Society with Pro Bono Economics, the charity I chair, to try and see how we can come up with real practical answers to this. And Andy Haldane, who's Chief Economist at the Bank of England, going to work lead the RSA, is very much a kind of helping me think through all of these issues about how we get these different sectors together. Because I think you can't just a lot of people look at just the charitable sector. And actually, it's not that, it's the interplay between them. You've got private sector now thinking about purpose. You've got the state saying, well, what's our role? And we're now amazingly into an era where virtually every country in the world is moving to a bigger state, whether they plan to or not. The state is doing a lot more. It's interfered in our lives far more than any of us ever thought it would. So we're in this place where there's a lot of things changing, and we need to try and work out how to solve this really difficult and persistent set of issues. But you're right that fundamentally we are a very centralized economy. And I think part of the answer to this is to find ways to decentralize and empower communities much more.
And it's interesting, there's been much more written, I think, about, you mentioned Andy Haldane, who wrote an essay for us on that exact question. But, I'm thinking of Raghuram Rajan's book on the third pillar and, how we rebalance it. The wonderful work that the late Rabbi Sachs did, talking about how the state has expanded into areas that, means that kind of it can only disappoint because it can't provide the stuff that the civil society and communities do provide. So it does feel, at least in a thinking sense, that we're moving towards that. But I suppose I still have a degree of skepticism that those in government will want to let go to try and make some of this happen.
One thing I would say is, and I've realized this with the wellbeing stuff, you have to win the intellectual arguments and you have to get people on your side, and eventually it feeds through. It's like the behavioral stuff. I remember when with David Halpin setting up the behavioral insight team, it was there. A lot of us were really quite passionate about understanding this version of economics, which said basically, curiously enough, we're dealing with humans, and humans don't get it all right, and they make mistakes. And and for a while, it was a kind of niche activity, but now I think it's becoming much more mainstream.
Brilliant. And so we've got quite a few questions on the civil service reform agenda. So if it's okay, we'll go back to just a few of those. But interestingly, I have got one question, which is sort of, I guess, links to your point about the movement of ministers. But people talk a lot about civil service reform. And again, I've got a few questions I am going to put you on that. But equally, do we need to see reform of our political institutions?
Oh, God, yes.
Well, there we go. So in what way?
Well, where to start? I think the system we have is fairly crazy in that where else would you have a job where there's no training, right? Who would accept it? Where there's none of the things that we all take for granted, appraisals every year, feedback, the things that make us better, learning from your mistakes. The only people that can throw out a prime minister are his political party or the electorate once every 5 years. Along the way, yes, the media give feedback and all the rest of it, but it's very hard for ministers on the nitty-gritty of their jobs to actually, how do they get better? How do they improve? And if you're going to move them so rapidly, then is there any incentive, to start off subjects which are only going to reach fruition when they've long gone somewhere else? So I think we could do a lot with thinking about for MPs, training MPs to be ministers. And it's really hard. The Institute of Government has tried, and it's a battle, really. And I just don't get it, why they wouldn't want to be much, much better at their jobs. So I think there's lots of things we could do with government. I think I've always been in favour of longer fixed terms, rather unfashionable at the moment, given that we seem to have a cross-party consensus to allow the Prime Minister to choose the date of the election, which I think is just, to use a technical term again, bonkers. But 5-year terms, I think, would help us to do that kind of longer term, to think longer term. So that there's lots of things like that. And I think finding that area where you can get political leadership, so you get the democratic part, and then you get some technocrats to deliver it. And, we struggle with this in certain areas, like the NHS, where, what's political and what's not. I think we found a really good solution to it in the Bank of England, where the Chancellor sets the inflation target, tells them what it is they're trying to achieve, and then an independent bunch of technocrats who know what they're doing try and deliver that for the Chancellor. That seems to work well. And I want to see if we've got other areas. It will be good to explore other areas where we can try that model, where absolutely democratically elected people who are accountable to the people and to Parliament set the objectives, and then they set people away to go and deliver them. And the other people are held to account for, have they delivered them? So people from the Bank of England appear before select committees to say, well, why is it that inflation, you were told to keep it at 2% and you didn't? Explain yourself.
Which might also give politicians more confidence as well, if there was that sort of accountability at or great accountability at the delivery level. Just linked to that question, what about Parliament? I was very, Parliament is supposed to be an institution of legislators and holding the executive to account. And, there's clearly challenges at the moment when you've got such a large majority that the sort of accountability point kind of drops away. But I think there's, at any point, I was very struck when I was in DWP as an advisor and we took through the welfare reform bill. I was very struck by just how rigged the process was for in Parliament for scrutinising that legislation. And it wasn't experts scrutinising it. It was very much a kind of trade-offs. You're going to put this in so that you could give that away. It didn't feel like there was particularly good, healthy scrutiny going on in legislation. Would you recognise that accountability?
Totally. If you just look at the amount of time that's given for particular bills, I could talk about ones on Brexit, but I will try and stay off that subject. You'd realise that it's incredibly hard, and the Commons, it's not really encouraged, because of the party discipline and the whipping system and all the rest of it. In the Lords, you'll find that they are keener to do scrutiny, and they kind of think in a rather more cross-party way. But the Lords has very, very little power when you're in a situation where the Commons, there's a large majority in the Commons. And the Lords has its own problems. We need reform. We're too big. The expenses system needs reform. I won't touch any money from the House of Lords because I just think it needs to be reformed, and I won't claim anything. It's just, there are lots of things about the Lords that need to be changed, but fundamentally a second chamber, which is a reforming chamber, would make a huge amount of difference, I think, that could really hold the Commons' feet to the fire in saying you need to scrutinise these stuff, because quite often with legislation we find it's rushed through, and the thing about legislation is it's quite clunky and it's quite rigid, and quite often it's out of date within a short time, or it's been too influenced by something that's happened immediately. You look back at things like the Dangerous Dogs Act. They're creatures of their time, whereas actually legislation should be something that's there for the longer term and that is flexible enough to allow you to kind of move with changes in the world that technology and other changes have brought.
I think there's also been a bit of a growing habit of sort of having God clauses in them where you can sort of basically do whatever you want because they're so kind of broad and wide ranging. But I would certainly agree that we were a lot more scared of the House of Lords and what they would do in terms of scrutiny than we ever were of the Commons. So can I ask about trust? Because trust is one of the things that I think spans a lot of the things we've discussed here. So be it confidence in our own institutions and trust in our institutions. Trust is one of the elements of well-being. It's really core to how people feel. But I think also trust in Parliament and its role, trust in the civil service, representing the country. How far do you think that's a problem today, and what can we do to rebuild trust if it is indeed kind of disintegrating?
Well, I mean, again, starting with the evidence, if you look at what people say in terms of, do you trust ministers? The numbers are incredibly low. Do you trust civil service? The numbers, I'm glad to say, are much, much higher. But that gap has never been as big. And that's very worrying to me. So yes, we need to rebuild trust. We need to, one thing I particularly think is, it used to be the case that, for me, a minister not telling the truth to Parliament would be just, that's it, right? And we've had instances where the national statisticians had to say, actually, that's not true what you said, that's not correct. Just blatantly, at best, misuse of information, at worst, lying. So I do think that trust is absolutely vital for our institutions, that we trust that the government is going to live by the rule of law. I mean, that's being questioned even now. So yes, we do absolutely need to rebuild trust. And you're absolutely right. Societies where there's high level of trust, where they always ask those questions and they do those tests where they leave wallets lying around and see if people return them to the police stations. Those countries with high trust have much higher levels of well-being. And for us to try and get a political system where we had a lot more trust. And I think that's partly the nature of our democracy. One of the things that I was very strongly supportive of was making sure that your vote has equal count wherever you are, in the sense of equalising the size of constituencies, in terms of numbers. And that hasn't happened, and that's to me, actually, people say it would support the Conservative Party or Labour, but that's not the point, really. It's the point that it's a democratic principle, and therefore we should do that, because otherwise, you could be in certain areas and your vote counts a lot less, and that can't be right.
Yeah. Well, I think we are getting the boundary reviews recommendations in the next few weeks. So you never know. Maybe we never know. creep towards some progress there. We've got about 4 minutes now left. So as just a final question, we're looking ahead to a spending review, hopefully finally a spending review that might go past 1 year. Let's assume it will. Let's say we get, ideally a 3-year spending review, probably I guess a 2-year. What would you most want to see in that? What do you think would be, in terms of the sort of the stuff we've been discussing around the recovery, building back better, what do you think would be one really kind of positive, either change in the way we do it, or a particular policy, or a particular thing to spend money on? What would be your one thing if you were pitching to CFT now? What would it be?
My number one would be, let's call it a spending review for well-being, to enhance the well-being of the nation. And what does that mean? Well, I'd say then please, for God's sake, increase the amount of money we spend on mental health, right? We talk about it, we claim that it's got parity, but we're not there. Secondly, start measuring the well-being of kids in school, and start incentivizing, start making that transparent and public, how schools are doing. And I guess then this whole point about social capital, social infrastructure, helping communities improve. Those would be, I have 3 things. There you go.
No, it's great. I can definitely sign up to that. And it is, one of the things that is striking, that we kind of mentioned a few names earlier as well, is that an economist is pitching for investment in the kind of social capital and the well-being and the sort of, I guess, eudaimonics rather than economics. That's been the kind of the outcome we want to achieve. So I'm very much behind your manifesto for the spending review. So Lord O'Donnell, thank you so much. You've been brilliant. It's been an incredibly wide-ranging conversation, and you've been incredibly candid and open. And I'm sure everybody who's been watching and listening will have both enjoyed the conversation, but also be able to take away lots that they've learned. And hopefully everyone listening will go away and champion well-being and social capital and social infrastructure at this point. Not that we're lobbying. So thank you so much again for giving up your time. It has been brilliant. Can I say thank you to everybody who's joined us? We have pretty much kept everyone engaged, which is brilliant. We haven't seen drop-offs on Zoom, which is wonderful, which shows how interesting Lord O'Donnell has been. Thank you for watching. If you've been watching on the live stream as well, we will be the video will be uploaded in full later on today, so you can share it around or watch it again if you want to. Otherwise, can I just say a final thank you to Gus O'Donnell? It has been brilliant to have you, and everyone else. And otherwise, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Very enjoyable.